Okay. Okay, let's go back into this. So what was I saying? Responsibility. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about responsibility, and initially I wasn't sure if I wanted to include this, or the idea of responsibility in our class on ethics, particularly because I thought it was in well, that kind of accountability was a good enough substitute. But I think now it's actually makes sense to have both concepts and kind of look at them separately and look at the differences between the two of them. So yeah, we can talk about responsibility today. Um, and I was going to say, like, I kind of at first glance, or it's not necessarily an idea that we have that is commonly thought of as part of um, kind of ethical debates, particularly the ones we've been looking at so far, or like the different ethical frameworks. We haven't mentioned responsibility in, let's say, in Kant. It's all about duty, slightly or fairly different actually from responsibility. When we talked about what else did we mention? Just kind of in all the traditional frameworks, we don't really talk about responsibility so much. We talk more about kind of values and rules uh, and kind of ways of behaving, but not so much of this idea of responsibility. But it is actually quite common, or quite like often thought of as an ethical issue. And the example I wanted to start with today is the rhetoric that we all witnessed in the beginning of the pandemic, particularly around wearing masks and getting vaccinated, and how this was very much portrayed as a personal responsibility and was kind of an individual behavior that we all had to exhibit to be considered responsible, whatever that meant, and that was kind of the responsible thing to do. And I found that quite interesting because it was clearly showed uh, how ethics is how responsibility is part of ethics, and how we think about it in very much kind of ethical terms, but it escapes a lot of the or some of the discussions that we have. And I wanted to start with kind of a bit of an unusual approach. Maybe I wanted to start talking about responsibility using analytic philosophy, which is not something I'm very familiar with. But I think it's quite interesting to see the different approaches, and I wanted to give you this approach because in many ways it tends to be fairly clear. Um, and I think it's interesting to compare this to the other approaches that I'm going to suggest in the second half of the lecture. So yeah, I just kind of thought it would be nice exercise to compare the two, and kind of how different ways of thinking about responsibilities work, and what different ways of being they offer to us. And I was before I realized you can't hear me, I was bragging about having a lovely shiny PowerPoint. So there it is, my lovely shiny PowerPoint. Where's it gone? Here. Okay. Um, okay. So what is responsibility? What do we understand by responsibility? Um, this is the kind of analytical approach. So this is in analytic philosophy, we're very much you can often see this approach of trying to define and delineate meaning very specifically, and trying to kind of separate different meanings of the same word. So it's almost like linguistic in a sense, trying to like discern meaning and the different layers of meaning. But the word itself, responsibility, and that's probably also why it hasn't been part of various ethical debates in the history of ethics, is that the word itself is surprisingly modern. It was actually begun with, or was initially a political concept rather than an ethical concept. And I know the distinction between the two is quite fuzzy, and we can't really. Lots of people will argue that politics and ethics are very related. Um, But yeah, responsibility was used initially politically, and it was particularly around kind of debates about representative government, democracy, who was to behave how um, who was meant to do certain things. Funnily enough, the the Oxford Dictionary says it was coined by Edmund Burke, the famous first conservative. So that's one thing. But it was all about kind of who is meant to be looking after particular things. So who's meant to be I'm trying to kind of substitute responsible, but who's meant to be taking care of and looking after particular things, who's meant to be doing what things in relation to kind of politics and government. And in kind of 20th century, it started entering other philosophical debates, particularly when we started having debates around free will and determinism. And actually, this is a trajectory we're gonna go through in this class. So we're gonna look at these funky analytic philosophy ideas, and then we're gonna move on to talking about free will and responsibility and Simone de Beauvoir, and then we're gonna move on to talk about even more wacky things, I suppose. So in a way, like the idea of responsibility, so moved from the political sphere to kind of individual free will, and only actually very recently we started talking about things like collective responsibility, and that's also something we're gonna mention in a bit. But these debates are very new for philosophy in comparison to, let's say, I don't know, debates that have existed since the ancient Greeks. Okay, so let's start with this analytic philosophy stuff. And these are the four things or the kind of four middle points that you can see on the PowerPoint. The responsible agency, the retrospective responsibility, the prospective responsibility, and responsibility as virtue. And don't worry if they sound really weird, because they are, and I'm going to explain what all of them mean. But as I said, analytic philosophy tries to delineate the meaning of a particular term, and these are the four main areas that analytic philosophers have identified in the field of, let's say, individual moral responsibility. And responsible agency is when a person is regarded as a kind of, they call it normal. I don't really like that term, but let's use it for inverted commas. So when the person is regarded as a normal moral agent, so you have the agency to act morally. Then the second one, retrospective responsibility, is when a person is judged for your actions. So that's when you've done something, and retrospectively you're judged for it. So maybe you I don't know, sent to prison or are blamed for something, and you're punished, and etc. etc. Then we have prospective, which means it refers to the future. So that would be kind of responsibilities attached to a particular role, something like you become a manager, and that comes with certain responsibilities, or you become a parent, for instance, and this also carries certain responsibilities. So you're looking after a dog, and that also comes with certain responsibilities. And some of them are more formalized than others. So like in a job description, for instance, you might have your responsibilities really formal. When it comes to having a dog, maybe they're less formal. So it's up to you to kind of figure out where they lie. And finally, the last one is responsibility as a virtue. So that's when we kind of think of responsibility as kind of as something in its own, like having a merit on its own. So you don't have to kind of consider it in in relation to any actions, it's just virtuous to be responsible. And I'm going to go over them a little bit just to kind of clarify a little bit more. So let's start with kind of the first two, the responsible agency. That's when we think of somebody as a responsible agent, as somebody who can act morally right if they want to, and that's really is kind of an attempt to answer the question, like what does it mean to be responsible? It's what kind of person or creature can be held responsible, and I think you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So obviously, like for instance, we can't hold babies responsible for their actions. So if you I don't know if the baby or your toddler breaks a glass, is probably your fault rather than the child's fault to have left it there, or perhaps maybe some people do. So these kind of are the boundaries of what is this responsible agency, who is allowed to be responsible. If somebody who's maybe mentally unstable, are they allowed to be responsible for themselves or for others? So it's all kind of these questions around trying to outline the features of a moral agent, I suppose. And obviously we know that at different points of history these things also change quite a lot. So for instance, we at some point women were not considered to be moral agents, or not at least like in the sense of being allowed to vote. We know that when we in this country, when we send prisoners to prison, you lose their right to vote. So we don't consider them capable of being moral agents anymore, because they have kind of lost that ability through their crime, through acting irresponsibly. And then the second one, the retrospective responsibility, that's as I said, like a question of how kind of judging past actions. So we often think about somebody, and we can think about somebody and say, oh well, this was they got drunk last night, lost their passport, very irresponsible behavior. So it's more about kind of trying to understand causality, I suppose. And it's backwards looking. It's more closely connected to these ideas of like praise or punishment or blame. So in a sense, this is a little bit closer to some of the ethical approaches that we already looked at. But it's but what's interesting, and I kind of want to complicate here, is thinking about how like responsibility often enters the picture when something is at fault, when something goes wrong, and then we try to find whose responsibility it is. And this is this is kind of like a common feature of this retrospective responsibility. So we rarely look at kind of who's responsible for things going right, because this is the one that's normalized, and we look for who's responsible for things going wrong, and then we look for responsibility. And then the prospective one, as I said, that's often like things that are related to your the role that you might fulfill. So it's a parent who is responsible for caring after a child, or maybe, I don't know, as a citizen you're responsible for obeying the law, or like acting in a certain way. So we often have like responsibilities that come with different professions, for instance, and some of these responsibilities are also, unlike others, kind of a bit more legally binding, or like a little bit like they're the ones that come fairly formalized, and not just in terms of jobs, but there are certain responsibilities that come with looking after a child, and if you don't fulfill them, then you lose that responsibility, and you might lose your child, for instance. And then the final one is this kind of responsibility as a virtue that I mentioned, which I think is quite interesting because it's just it's it's almost kind of like this nebulous idea of it reminds me of when big corporations talk about being responsible or being ethical, and you can say like, oh God, I can't even give an example of an ethical corporation, but like it's kind of this like nebulous idea of trying to uh, see responsibility as a virtue, and trying to attach it to sorry, I meant not as a virtue, as an attribute, as like a quality that that is like a positive quality that somebody has, and trying to attach it to somebody. Right, so yeah, so this is kind of the what I wanted to begin with, and similarly we can apply similar ways of thinking to collective responsibility. So often in the analytic philosophy, I suppose, we can think about collective responsibility in terms of kind of, or we think about it more in terms of how groups behave within and outside of groups. So whether, for instance, the whole group is liable for the actions of one member of that group, or whether the certain members of the group can hold other members of the group responsible for the behavior of the group. So there's like some interesting distinctions that can be made there. But I wanted to I wanted to start with this because I wanted to kind of show or like tie this to our reading. But before I do, there we go. Before I do, I want to briefly go to Simone de Beauvoir, who some of you might know already, or you might not know, and try to. So we're going to start complicating these kind of very nicely, clearly delineated ideas of what responsibility is, and try to, make them a lot more complicated. And then talk about how that relates to the little chapter that I put on for reading. So with Simone de Beauvoir, she wrote this book, Ethics of Ambiguity, just after the Second World War, and she was, as many other philosophers around that time, very concerned with how to behave ethically, what responsibility we have towards each other, how can we fight oppression, how can we make sure that this event doesn't repeat. And in many ways she was an existentialist. She was also the wife of Jean-Paul Sartre. So in many ways she is concerned with ideas that he had developed in his previous works, and she had also developed in her previous works. But the crux of the existentialist ideas is that we are all human beings are ultimately free, like entirely free, like some kind of like a big scary ocean free, like we have complete freedom, and that's the kind of tragedy of human existence, and also the difficulty of human existence. So it's not a nice kind of freedom. It's it's a pretty scary type of freedom. And so she begins that work from that same premise. So she starts with the idea that all existence is contingent, so we're not born for a purpose, and there is no kind of predetermined human essence or standard of value. She very much rejects ideas of God or teleology. It's all about the kind of being here and now with her. And this is an argument that she develops in previous work, so she uses it as a starting point for the ethics of ambiguity, and she starts by asserting that the tragic condition of the human situation is that we experience freedom, and that freedom is kind of spontaneous, and it comes, it's like this internal drive, but it's constantly crushed by the world that we live in. It can never be actualized. Although she does, at the end of the book, she does talk about how it can be actualized. So I'll mention that too. But human, what's interesting about the book is that she's actually one of the first ethical philosophers to talk about, to start talking about children. As I said earlier, children are not often in the realm of ethical thought, particularly because they're not considered ethical agents. But she starts not necessarily with children as ethical agents, but with the kind of experience that children have when they're first born. And she says, okay, when we first come in this world, we experience this kind of ultimate freedom and ultimate spontaneity, and we have no care in the world. I realize that's a bit of a generalization, but we're just kind of these pure, carefree and entirely free beings, and then we have to go through our parents to rely on them to mediate that world for us, because we start experiencing what she describes as this existential weight of the world. And we start experiencing this, and I guess that's in the form of what would be encounters with others that are not so pleasant, maybe things we don't understand, maybe being given some kind of cares or responsibilities, and etc., etc. So we kind of have to have that mediated by our parents all the time. So that becomes we become less and less attached to our parents as we grow up, and then we're kind of finally able to mediate it for ourselves, in a way. And this the entire of human existence, she says, is this kind of ambiguous mixture of internal freedom and the weight of the world that imposes itself in a manner that's not of our choosing and is outside of our control. So she says, we kind of constantly have this struggle between our own internal freedom and the things that are outside of our control, and we have to live with that ambiguity. We have to live in kind of that battle. And she says to act ethically really just means we have to accept that ambiguity. We have to accept that things are ambiguous. And I think that's really interesting because clearly earlier, just now, when we talked about responsibility, like the role of analytic philosophy is to get rid of that ambiguity, to make sure that there is no ambiguity around ethical or any terminology. But then, if we are to start with this ambiguity, what ethics do we have that are this ambiguous, or exist with, if we accept this ambiguity? So for her, ethical action is constantly at the crossroads of the desire for personal freedom, or the internal spontaneity that we have, and the facts of the world, what's happening around us, the things that are outside of our control, and she's got this. I can't go in that much detail, but she's got this wonderful way of explaining. It's fairly Nietzschean as well, of explaining how you can have different positions in or like different ways of existence. Like, this is not a terminology she uses, but I think it makes sense. Different ways of being, which put you in kind of different in different positions around ethical action. So she talks about the nihilist, for instance, as somebody who's kind of rejected all truths about the. No, let me actually retract, because the other ones, the nihilist should come third, really. So she describes various ways in which people negotiate this tension between freedom and responsibility to the world, and she uses the example of the child. So the child cannot be, is neither moral or immoral, cannot be, is not an ethical agent. But then the first category of like kind of a bad ethical agent, or she calls it bad faith, that's also from Nietzsche, is the sub-man, or that's somebody who is kind of, through their own laziness and boredom and lack of engagement in the world, ends up restraining their original spontaneity and their original freedom, and becomes susceptible, becomes a useful pawn that is then used by, and that's the other category, the serious man. So the serious man is the most common one, and I think the best way to think about it is like as somebody who is very, very dogmatic, who like they believe in absolute and unconditional rules and values and kind of universals, for instance, and they're willing to subordinate their own freedom and other people's freedom under these values. So we've got on one hand the subman, who is easily tricked because they're too lazy. This is like, and I'm kind of simplifying it a bit. I think she's got, but the terms are correct. And then we have the serious man, who's the dogmatic, like really, really kind of strict person. I really like this idea that this would be the serious man. I think it's really Kafkaesque. And then we have the nihilist, who's somebody who was a serious man but got disappointed, and then they turn that seriousness back on themselves. So that would be somebody who understands the seriousness. So, for instance, an example of the serious man is not necessarily somebody who's kind of morally pure, but somebody who holds certain values as like above anything else. And that could be, for instance, like it could be power, not even like a particularly like morally good value, but it could be I don't know, somebody who wants to be famous beyond anything else, or maybe somebody who I don't know, it could be the military, for instance, for a general. So like somebody who just upholds something above anything else. And then the nihilist is somebody who's been there and then gone disappointed, and then they deny that the world has any meaning at all. So they have another type of bad faith, she calls it. And then the final one, the one that she likes, is, and this again very Nietzschean, is the adventurer. And the adventurer is somebody who's not really interested in Theorist is on nihilism, but is the person who is kind of throws themselves into life and tries to, um, uh, I guess, like follow their personal freedom more, or like chooses actions for their own sake. But they're also a little bit selfish, so when they choose things, um, they they choose them for their own satisfaction and their own kind of gratification. So it can potentially, like, it's also like not necessarily the most um, morally. Neither of them is like a morally good character or ethically well behaved. Um, and she disagrees with all of them. She says what all of them are missing is really kind of the um, like the responsibility that we have towards each other. So she argues that freedom can only be actualized um, uh, with everybody else's freedom. So this tension that exists, we can't ever resolve it unless we kind of resolve it collectively. And I think that's really interesting. So the example that she talks about is the, it is kind of like almost in opposition to an example by Sartre. So Sartre himself had similar ideas about ethics, but he believed that, excuse me, he believed that uh, all, situ- all situations can be transcended. Whatever your individual circumstances are and however hard they were, you could kind of always move beyond them, do whatever it is required to move past them. But she recognized that there are situations in which you can't move past them, and particularly she was talking about the female experience and or the experiences of women and the experiences of slaves who exist in a world in which like all values and customs and laws are given to them without them being able to choose them. Um, and uh, and in this situation, she says that in these situations there is no possibility for transcendence. You can't just will yourself out of being a slave or being oppressed in whatever form it is. Um, and uh, and she says that in many situations the reason for that is because the possibility, like it is not even known that it is possible to move beyond them. So to these people, the natural order of the world appears to be to be it. There is no kind of they believe or they're made to believe that the place that they inhabit in this world is given to them by nature or by God or by some kind of um, other higher order. And these are the situations in which she says we need to we have a responsibility. We need to, she's actually quite radical in that she even says, you know, in these situations even certain things as violence are acceptable. She she goes to the extent of kind of outlining um, uh, what are the particular situations in which violence is acceptable. She says, you know, if we can't take this lightly. Just because in these situations it is acceptable to use violence doesn't mean that we need to kind of take it lightly and not take it, not consider it. So she like actually kind of sits down and outlines all these situations in which she believes um, we have responsibility to the point of like even being allowed to use violence. Um, so that's another way of thinking about responsibility, and that leads me to the one that I actually kind of really wanted to talk about today, which is um, this chapter that I posted, and particularly um, about ideas of ethical responsibility that are different. Um, And the chapter is called Ethical Images of Thought, which is, I thought I would just explain what that means. And this is an expression from Deleuze. The image of thought for him is the so the ethical image of thought just means the ways in which we the kind of big cloud of words and ideas and thoughts that we have had about ethics that have kind of almost become like the norm, or less, maybe not so much the norm, but they've become common sense. So an image of thought is like, think about it like almost like, I don't know, a picture of what thinking of like a thought is. So if you can imagine a picture of all the ethical thought so far, that would be the image of thought. So like kind of all these ideas and all these concepts and things that we've developed and etc., that have now almost become a common sense. And Deleuze doesn't like this. He's really against this idea of common sense. He says common sense is the kind of the scariest thing, because it's just makes us think about that things are just normal, and it's hard to question things, but we really need to learn how to do this. And this chapter is not by Deleuze. If you opened it, you would know, because it's actually comprehensible. But it's by an ethical theorist, Karen Howe. I think we maybe already spoke about her once. And she starts by making this interesting claim about multiplicity and plurality. And I'm just going to reiterate it briefly. So she says, when we think about something, whatever it is, and we have been thinking about it for centuries and centuries and centuries, it's kind of unavoidable that we have a bunch of concepts, like all the ideas and concepts about this topic are kind of slowly increasing, because it's a complex topic. We think about it all the time, and we see this increase in the number of concepts that are related to that topic. And so if, I don't know, 2,000 years ago, we thought, I don't know, about virtues, Aristotle defined 7 virtues, and that was it. But now we can maybe talk about virtues in like a lot more complex ways, and we have all these like other ideas and concepts related to that topic. And she says there is kind of 2 ways in which this proliferation of concepts can be divided, maybe. So on one hand, we have something that she calls a plurality, which is when concepts kind of coexist within a bubble. So the concepts of pluralities are frequently elaborated along a single plane. So each member of this set is related to all of the other members by the virtue of a third term. So something like a linear set would be a good one. Or like maybe we think about directions, and the plurality of directions is east, west, south, north, and then all the ones in the middle, and like all the degrees. So we have kind of concepts that are within that bubble. So something for Kant, maybe Kantian moral philosophy could be what would it be, like the categorical imperative, it would be duty, it would be rationality, moral action, truth. So you have like kind of all these kind of plurality of concepts within this framework. But then she says we have also kind of the concept of multiplicity, which refers to a collection of things or beings which has emerged through kind of on the fringes, or kind of outside maybe of this bubble. So they're not really kind of elaborations of this current theme, and they're not really reducible to the internal axis of coherence that plurality, or like the elements of like a plural system, are reduced to, but they are kind of a multiplication of systems. So I'm trying to think of an example. It's so trying to think of like a philosophical example. Well, just the whole philosophy of ethics, for instance, is a multiplicity. So it's an incomplete whole, and all the elements of it kind of are radically different. They're heterogeneous, but they also are somehow related. And and she starts with this because she says, okay, so we can look at when we think about ethics, we think about ways of being in the world, and often each ethical or moral theory would try to make a claim that it's kind of the one. It will make a claim that its view of reality is better than any other view of reality. And within it, it will have a proliferation of concepts and ideas and etc. etc. That kind of almost like once you buy it, once you think this is the better view of reality, then you have all of these tools at its disposal. I'm gonna give her example. I'm gonna talk about her example because I think it's a really good one. So the example that she gives is about physics. I don't know enough about physics to know whether this is a fair comparison, but she says, okay, for like hundreds of years in physics, the Newtonian physics were considered to be kind of the pinnacle, like the physics that was studied, and it was there was a proliferation of concepts within. There was a plurality of concepts within Newtonian physics, and like the field of mechanics and etc. etc. But kind of towards the end of the 20th century, this field of classical mechanics and this Newtonian physics, despite this proliferation of concepts and kind of all these works that were done within it, it started becoming more and more inadequate to describe phenomenon that physicists were discovering, and kind of slowly things moved, and then now we have the field of quantum physics, for example, and her argument, or like kind of her point with this example, is that neither of these two separate fields of physics is inadequate, or like is like kind of entirely wrong or useless. They just both describe different things. They're just kind of two different sets of tools that we can use to understand reality and to experiment on, or like kind of make sense of the world. So this would be what she calls multiplicity of ontologies, so ways of looking at this world, or ways of understanding the world. So on one hand, you have Newtonian physics, on the other hand, quantum physics, and they are both tools that show us different ways about the world, about the nature of reality. And I like this because I think it kind of is a very clever way of then starting to think again about responsibility and which view of reality is better. So is it better to kind of think about responsibility as like something that belongs to the moral agent, or as something that's collective? Is the Beauvoir's view of like responsible freedom the one that is like, you know, is the one that's better? And we don't really have that much time to go into this, but Karen Howe's point is that the better view of reality is the one that enables us to have the greatest capacity to respond to reality. So it's not really like, we can say that if we're thinking again about like Newtonian and quantum physics, we can say, okay, well, the better model is the one that like gives us better evidence. If it captures something and doesn't capture, then clearly this is the correct one, and the other one is the incorrect one. Or sometimes we can say that the better view of reality is the one that has the most predictive power. So if this helps us predict the future, or like if this helps us kind of understand what's going to happen later, then that's better. But Howe, and I think I agree with her, advocates for this kind of more pragmatic method, which is the better view of reality is the one that leads us to, or that helps us accomplish something of value, something that we value, and that is the one that enables the greatest capacity to respond to reality. And I hope you can kind of see this, the connection between this and Spinoza, and kind of increasing one's affect and one's capacity to respond to the world. And the one that I don't have enough time to talk about, but we'll come back to it, is Donna Haraway, who her most recent book is just one of the most beautiful, wackiest things I've ever read, and she proposes kind of almost like a split of this term of responsibility to response and ability. So it is the ability to respond to the world, to engage with the different kinds of responses to this world. And Haraway, she's also a feminist who's an advocate of these relational ethics and kind of embodied practices. And the examples that she talks about in the book about where she describes responsibility are when I'm not quite, I'm sure she talks about pigeons and kind of how pigeons coexist with the wild, and carrier pigeons, and training dogs to be able to smell cancer, and like all of these kind of ways in which different, I guess, beings in the world are able to learn to respond to each other differently, or like kind of engage with each other differently. And I just love how this is so detached from these kind of ideas of moral responsibility as like a rational agent that then takes the blame if they don't do something. I think it's a lot more interesting to talk about our abilities to respond to things, and this ties back with the Beauvoir just now, that when we were discussing of like this recognition that that certain people are not in a position to be able to kind of transcend their oppression, to move past their oppression, because they don't feel because their oppression has been so normalized for them. And then I think this ties really nicely with this idea of responsibility, because kind of the form of oppression in that sense is restricting their ability to respond to the world, and then our responsibility is to increase that capacity or that responsibility. So in a way, like we're tying all these strings together, but drawing on different things. And I think I'm going to stop here now because it's gone 8. And what I'm going to do is we're going to have about 10 minutes. And I'm going to post a link in on River for the seminar. And I'll see you there in about 10 minutes.